Case 1. Darrell Brooks. The red SUV sliced through the Christmas parade like a blade through paper. And for the people of Waukesha, Wisconsin, November 21st, 2021, would forever mark the day their hometown tradition became a national tragedy. Darrell Brooks was 39 years old when he drove through crowds of families, dancers, and children that Sunday afternoon. Before that moment, he had lived a life marked by instability and conflict. Born and raised in Milwaukee without a father figure, Brooks struggled with mental health challenges from childhood, diagnosed with bipolar disorder at age 12 following psychiatric hospitalization. He never completed his formal education, dropping out of high school after being charged with his first felony, substantial battery, while still a junior. That conviction in 1999 sent him to jail for 2 years, beginning a pattern that would continue for more than 2 decades. His criminal history stretched across multiple counties, accumulating charges for domestic violence, intimidation, reckless endangerment, and bail jumping. By the time he reached middle age, Brooks had established a reputation for volatility and disregard for legal consequences. Just days before the parade, he had been involved in a domestic incident with his girlfriend, allegedly running her over with his vehicle in a Milwaukee parking lot. Released on inappropriately low bail despite his extensive record, he was free to drive to Waukesha that November morning. What happened next unfolded with terrifying speed. Shortly before 1 in the afternoon, Brooks steered his Ford Escape through the parade route on Main Street, bypassing safety barriers and accelerating into the procession. Officers on the scene reported that he looked directly at them with no emotion as they shouted for him to stop. Instead of braking, he zigzagged through the crowd, striking person after person in a pattern prosecutors would later describe as deliberate. 62 individuals were injured, many suffering life-altering trauma. 6 people lost their lives that day. Among the deceased were 8-year-old Jackson Sparks, who had been marching with his baseball team, and 4 members of the beloved Milwaukee Dancing Grannies, Virginia Sorensen, Leanna Owen, Tamara Durant, and William Hospel, the husband of another dancing granny who survived. The 6th victim, Jane Kulik, had also been celebrating that day. Each victim had been honoring community, tradition, and the approaching holiday season when their lives were stolen. Within hours, authorities located Brooks near the parade's end, close to his abandoned vehicle. When taken into custody, he made no attempt to flee or fight. The evidence against him was overwhelming: surveillance footage, witness testimony, and his own admissions during questioning. Yet as the legal process began, Brooks adopted a confrontational and bizarre defense strategy that would define his trial. Charged with 76 counts, including 6 for first-degree intentional homicide, he initially entered a plea of not guilty by reason of mental disease. However, just before trial commenced in October 2022, he withdrew that plea, dismissed his public defenders, and chose to represent himself. Judge Jennifer Dorrow granted his request, and what followed became one of the most chaotic courtroom spectacles in recent Wisconsin history. Throughout the month-long trial, Brooks disrupted proceedings constantly. He refused to acknowledge his own name, interrupted the judge repeatedly, questioned victims while they testified, and spouted pseudo-legal arguments drawn from sovereign citizen ideology. He claimed the court lacked jurisdiction over him, challenged established legal procedures, and at one point removed his shirt in protest. Judge Dorrow had him removed from the courtroom multiple times, placing him in an adjacent room where he appeared via video monitor, often with his microphone muted due to continued outbursts. Prosecutors presented a methodical case. District Attorney Susan Opper emphasized that Brooks had multiple opportunities to stop, to turn away, to avoid the crowd. Instead, he had accelerated. Witnesses described how bodies flew through the air, how the vehicle never slowed, how screams filled Main Street. The defense, such as it was, with Brooks acting as his own attorney, offered scattered claims about vehicle malfunction and lack of intent, but provided no coherent alternative explanation. On October 26, 2022, after deliberating for just over 3 hours, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all 76 charges. Brooks sat silently, head in hands, as the word guilty echoed through the courtroom again and again. The clean sweep for the prosecution meant mandatory life sentences for each homicide count. Sentencing hearings stretched across 2 days in mid-November. 45 victims and family members delivered impact statements, many through tears, describing the permanent scars left by Brooks's actions. Children spoke of nightmares and fear of cars. Parents recounted watching their loved ones struck down. One young dancer told the court she had lost a piece of herself that day and was still searching for it. Brooks's family also testified, with his grandmother and mother pleading for leniency and psychiatric treatment, emphasizing his long battle with mental illness. But Judge Darrell rejected the mental health argument. 4 psychologists who evaluated Brooks found he suffered from antisocial personality disorder, not a mental illness that would excuse his conduct. The judge stated clearly that Brooks understood right from wrong and simply chose to ignore his conscience, driven by anger and rage. On November 16, 2022, Judge Darrell imposed the maximum sentence. Brooks received 6 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole for the homicide convictions, plus an additional 762.5 years on the remaining charges. She described him as someone who had chosen a path of evil and declared that the community could only be safe if he remained incarcerated for the rest of his life. Today, Darrell Brooks sits in a maximum security prison, having been transferred out of Wisconsin to a facility in another state. He has filed multiple requests for extensions to appeal his conviction, but no successful challenges have emerged. His name remains synonymous with one of Wisconsin's deadliest mass casualty events, and the community of Waukesha continues to heal under the banner of Waukesha Strong. But across town, another case was unfolding, one that would prove that horror doesn't only strike in public spaces, and that sometimes the most disturbing crimes happen behind closed doors. Case 2. Taylor Schabusiness. When Tara Pekanich descended the basement stairs of her Green Bay home on February 23, 2022, she discovered something no parent should ever see: her son's severed head in a bucket covered with a towel. Taylor Schabusiness was 25 years old when she committed one of the most disturbing homicides in Wisconsin's recent history. Born Taylor Coronado, she had grown up in a troubled environment, losing her mother to sudden death during her teenage years, a trauma that family members said profoundly affected her. She struggled with substance use and mental health challenges, cycling through relationships and encounters with law enforcement. By early 2022, she had a 2-year-old child who had been removed from her care by Child Protective Services shortly after birth. Her life was marked by instability, methamphetamine addiction, and a pattern of poor decision-making that would culminate in unspeakable violence. Shad Therian was 24, a quiet young man living with his mother in Green Bay. He and Schabusiness had known each other since their high school years, maintaining an on and off relationship that included encounters involving substances and risky behavior. On the evening of February 21st, Schabusiness picked up Therian from his mother's home. Accompanied by a friend, they went to an apartment on Eastman Avenue, where they used cannabis. After the friend left, Schabusiness and Therian consumed methamphetamine and injected trazodone, a sedative medication being misused recreationally. They returned to the Pekanich home while Shad's mother and her boyfriend were away. In the basement, They engaged in activities that Schabusiness would later describe to investigators involved restraint and what is sometimes called erotic asphyxiation. Using metal chains, she began restricting his breathing, but instead of stopping when Therian showed signs of distress, she continued. For 3 to 5 minutes, she strangled him until he coughed up blood and died. What followed shocked even seasoned investigators. Rather than calling for help or fleeing the scene, Schabusiness spent hours with Therian's body, engaging in acts that prosecutors would describe as desecration. The following morning, she used knives from the kitchen to dismember him methodically. She positioned his body over a bucket and storage tote to collect blood, which she then dumped down the basement shower drain. She removed internal organs, placing them in plastic bags and cardboard boxes scattered throughout the basement. She took some remains with her when she left, loading them into a gold minivan. When Therian's mother returned home in the early hours of February 23rd and realized her son was missing, she went to check the basement and found the bucket containing his head and other body parts. Police arrived within minutes. The scene they discovered was beyond comprehension. Human organs stuffed into bags, scattered pieces throughout the residence, evidence of methodical dismemberment. Authorities immediately began searching for Schabusiness, locating her later that day at an apartment complex on Eastman Avenue. Her clothing was covered in dried blood, her thumb bore a fresh cut, and her arm showed scratches she claimed were self-inflicted. She was arrested and charged with first-degree intentional homicide, mutilation of a corpse, and third-degree assault. During interrogation, Schabusiness spoke at length with investigators, providing disturbing details about the events. She mentioned having a thing with Jeffrey Dahmer, a reference to the notorious Milwaukee serial killer, despite the fact that Dahmer had been deceased for nearly 3 decades. Her statements revealed a detachment from reality that her defense team would later attempt to use as the foundation for an insanity plea. In September 2022, her attorney submitted not guilty by reason of mental disease defense. However, the legal process was repeatedly disrupted by Schabusiness' own behavior. On February 14, 2023, during a motion hearing about trial scheduling, she attacked her attorney Quinn Jolly in open court. Video footage captured her lunging at him before a deputy wrestled her to the floor. She would later attack correctional staff as well, requiring her to wear a spit hood during subsequent court appearances. The trial proceeded in 2 phases. In July 2023, jurors first determined whether she had committed the crimes, a question answered quickly with guilty verdicts on all counts after less than an hour of deliberation. The second phase addressed her mental state, with the defense arguing she suffered from drug-induced psychosis and long-standing psychiatric disorders that prevented her from understanding right from wrong. Forensic psychologists testified for both sides, examining whether methamphetamine use and pre-existing conditions constituted legal insanity under Wisconsin law. Prosecutors countered that her behavior after the incident, cleaning the crime scene, hiding evidence, transporting remains, demonstrated clear awareness of wrongdoing. Her lucid statements to police, captured on video, showed someone who understood the consequences of her actions. The jury agreed, finding in less than an hour that she was not mentally ill at the time of the killing. Sentencing took place on September 26, 2023. Members of Therian's family delivered emotional testimony. Some, like his father Michael, offered forgiveness, saying everyone makes bad choices and expressing hope for her rehabilitation. Others were less merciful, with his uncle Kelly stating he would pray she met the same fate as her idealistic Jeffrey Dahmer. Judge Thomas Walsh described the offense as beyond superlatives, stating the community had been shocked by actions so foreign to human decency. Schabusiness' defense attorney argued she was not a monster and that at 25, time remained for rehabilitation. But when given the opportunity to speak, Schabusiness simply said, No, there isn't. The judge sentenced her to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for the homicide charge, plus consecutive terms totaling 10.5 additional years for mutilation and assault. The life sentence means she will never be eligible for release. Since her conviction, Schabusiness has remained incarcerated, where she has continued to exhibit violent behavior. In late 2024, she was convicted of attacking a prison staff member. Appeals have been filed challenging her conviction, though no significant progress has been made. Her case stands as one of Wisconsin's most disturbing criminal prosecutions, a reminder that even in a state accustomed to high-profile violence, some acts defy comprehension. Yet even as Schabusiness' trial concluded, investigators were already working another case from years earlier, one involving a former police officer who had hidden a terrible secret for far too long. Case 3. Stephen Zelich. Highway workers along a rural stretch of road in Walworth County made a discovery on June 5, 2014, that would haunt them for years. 2 suitcases, buzzing with flies, dumped in a ditch. Stephen Mark Zelich had worn a badge for 12 years as a police officer in West Allis, Wisconsin, a Milwaukee suburb. To his colleagues and neighbors, he appeared unremarkable, a middle-aged man who kept to himself, lived quietly, and maintained steady employment. But online, under the username Mere Handcuffs, Zelich lived a double life within communities devoted to dominance, submission, and control. It was through these websites that he found his victims, 2 women whose trust in him would prove fatal. Jennifer Games was 19 years old, a young woman from Cottage Grove, Oregon, who had spent much of her adolescence in the foster care system. Despite a difficult upbringing, her mother incarcerated, her father distant in Mexico, she had graduated with honors from an alternative high school and was attending community college on scholarship when she encountered Zelich online. He contacted her through an adult website when she was 16, maintaining communication for months before reconnecting when she turned 18. He convinced her to travel to Wisconsin in August 2012, promising a relationship where she could live with him as his submissive partner. She arrived with her belongings packed in a single suitcase, believing she was starting a new chapter. Zelich took her to a hotel room in Kenosha County, where they spent days engaging in activities he described as consensual scenes involving restraint. But on the final morning before checkout, he positioned her on the bed, handcuffed and blindfolded, with a ball gag in her mouth. Then he wrapped a rope around her neck and began what practitioners call breath play. The restriction of oxygen for purposes Zelich claimed were consensual. According to his later statements to investigators, he alternated between tightening and loosening the rope, controlling her airway for progressively longer intervals. Eventually, he stopped loosening it altogether. Jennifer collapsed, coughing blood, and died within minutes. Zelich would later claim it was accidental, that the activity had gone too far. But prosecutors noted he had training as a police officer. He knew CPR, he understood life-saving measures, yet he made no attempt to help her. Instead, he placed her body back into the suitcase she had brought from Oregon, loaded it into his vehicle, and drove to his West Allis apartment. There, he cleared out his refrigerator completely and placed her remains inside, where they would stay for over a year. He kept Jenny Games' body in his kitchen refrigerator while he continued his daily routine, working, sleeping, living alongside evidence of what he had done. 15 months later, in November 2013, Zelich returned to his online haunts. He connected with Laura Jean Simonson, a 37-year-old woman from Farmington, Minnesota. Like Games, she was seeking connection within communities Zelich frequented. He convinced her to meet him at a hotel in Rochester, Minnesota, where he promised to bring her back to Wisconsin to live with him permanently. What he didn't tell her was that his refrigerator already contained the decomposing body of his previous victim. Over 24 hours at the Rochester hotel, Zelich repeated the same pattern, He restrained Simonson using handcuffs, tape, blindfolds, and gags to render her completely helpless. On the final morning, he once again initiated breath play, wrapping rope around her neck while she knelt blindfolded on the bed. Just as with Games, he tightened the rope until she died, claiming later that it was another accident, another moment where control slipped into killing. He placed Laura's body in her suitcase, drove back to Wisconsin, and stored her remains alongside Jenny's in his home. But by June 2014, with 2 bodies in his possession, Zelich needed to act. He loaded both suitcases into his trunk and drove to a remote stretch of highway in Walworth County. There, he abandoned them in a ditch and drove away. The discovery by highway maintenance workers triggered a massive investigation. Autopsies determined both women had died from airway obstruction and neck compression. Dental records and fingerprints identified the victims. When police in Minnesota began investigating Simonson's disappearance months earlier, they had actually visited Zelich's apartment and questioned him. He lied, claiming he barely knew her and hadn't seen her in months. But surveillance footage from the Rochester Hotel told a different story, showing Zelich and Simonson checking in together. Phone records, internet searches, and witness statements built an overwhelming case. In August 2014, authorities arrested him and charged him with first-degree intentional homicide in Wisconsin for Games's death, and later with second-degree murder in Minnesota for Simonson's killing. Zelich's defense attorneys argued the deaths were tragic accidents during consensual activities that went too far. They emphasized his lack of prior violence, his cooperation with investigators, and his expressions of remorse. But prosecutors painted a different picture: a predator who targeted vulnerable women through online platforms, luring them with promises of care and partnership, then killing them during encounters designed to give him absolute control. Kenosha County Deputy District Attorney Michael Gravely argued that Zelich had specifically chosen victims without strong family ties or support systems, women who could disappear without immediate alarm. He emphasized that Zelich's actions after each death, hiding bodies, lying to police, continuing to search for new victims, demonstrated consciousness of guilt, not accident or mistake. In January 2016, Zelich pleaded guilty to first-degree reckless homicide in Games's death. On March 30th, 2016, Judge Bruce Schroeder sentenced him to 35 years in prison, calling the crime monstrous and the facts ghastly. The judge rejected defense requests for leniency, noting that even after killing Games, Zelich had continued seeking victims online, even recruiting another woman to be his permanent slave. Around the same time, he dumped the suitcases. In February 2017, Minnesota courts sentenced him to 25 years for Simonson's murder. Combined with additional time for concealing both corpses, Zelich's total sentence reached 70 years, with a minimum non-parole period exceeding 58 years. Given his age at sentencing, this constitutes a de facto life sentence. His earliest possible release would occur when he is in his late 80s, if he lives that long. Today, Stephen Zelich remains incarcerated, his name a chilling reminder that predators can hide behind badges, behind screens, and behind personas that seem trustworthy until it's far too late. But while Zelich's crimes shocked communities across state lines, another Wisconsin case was about to capture national attention, one involving a young girl whose courage would inspire millions. Case 4. Jake Patterson. In the frozen darkness of a January night in rural Wisconsin, a 13-year-old girl ran barefoot through the snow, wearing only pajamas and oversized sneakers, desperate for help. And with her escape, she ended one of the nation's most intensive searches for a missing child. Jake Thomas Patterson was 21 years old on October 15, 2018, when he arrived at the Kloss family home in Barron County with a 12-gauge shotgun and a plan he had rehearsed multiple times. To those who knew him, Patterson was quiet and directionless, a young man who had struggled to find his place after high school, briefly enlisting in the Marines, only to wash out of boot camp after 5 weeks. He bounced between temporary jobs at cheese factories and turkey processing plants, living with his parents in the small town of Gordon, about 70 miles north of Barron. Former classmates remembered him as bookish and introverted, someone who seemed lost rather than dangerous. But beneath that unremarkable exterior, Patterson harbored disturbing fantasies about control and captivity. His obsession with 13-year-old Jamie Kloss began by pure chance. One morning in early October, while driving to a temporary job, Patterson's car stopped behind a school bus near the Kloss residence. As Jamie boarded the bus, he later told investigators he instantly knew she would be his target. He had no prior connection to the family, had never met the girl before, and knew nothing about them beyond what he could observe from the roadside. But in that moment, prosecutors said, Patterson decided Jamie would become his captive. He spent the following days planning meticulously. He drove to the Kloss home twice that month, scoping out the property, but aborted both attempts when he saw cars in the driveway or lights suggesting people were awake. He shaved his head and face to avoid leaving forensic evidence. He gathered duct tape, rope, and his father's shotgun. Then, just before 1 a.m. on October 15th, he made his third and final approach. James Kloss, 56, was awakened by the family dog barking. Through the glass pane of the front door, he shone a light on the figure outside. Mistaking Patterson for a law enforcement officer, he asked to see a badge. Patterson responded by shouting profanity and commands to open the door. When James hesitated, Patterson fired through the glass, striking him fatally. Jamie and her mother, Denise, heard the gunshot and ran to the bathroom, where Denise held her daughter in a protective embrace. Patterson kicked in the bathroom door, bound Jamie's wrists and ankles with duct tape, and covered her mouth. Then he turned the shotgun on Denise Kloss, 46, and ended her life as well. He dragged Jamie outside and placed her in the trunk of his vehicle. The entire attack lasted minutes. As Patterson drove away into the night, a massive search began, one that would stretch across months and involve hundreds of law enforcement personnel from multiple agencies. Amber alerts blanketed the region. Volunteers distributed flyers. The FBI joined local authorities in combing through tips and leads. But without witnesses, security footage, or a clear motive, investigators struggled to identify a suspect. Meanwhile, Patterson held Jamie captive at his family's remote cabin in Gordon, hidden in plain sight. He forced her to hide under his twin bed whenever anyone visited, including his father, who came by regularly on Saturdays. Patterson would barricade the bed with storage bins filled with weightlifting equipment, trapping her beneath for up to 12 hours at a time with no food, water, or access to a bathroom. He turned up music to mask any sound she might make. When no one was around, he controlled her movements, dictating when she could eat, sleep, or speak. He threatened that terrible things would happen if she tried to escape. For 88 days, Jamie endured this nightmare. But on January 10th, 2019, Patterson made a mistake. He told her he was leaving for a few hours to apply for a job at a liquor distributor in Superior. Seizing the opportunity, Jamie pushed aside the weights and bins, crawled out from under the bed, put on a pair of Patterson's sneakers, and fled into the frigid Wisconsin winter. She ran through the snow until she encountered a neighbor, Jean Nutter, walking her dog. Nutter took her to the nearby home of Kristen and Peter Kacinskas, pounded on their door, and shouted that this was Jamie Kloss, and they needed to call police immediately. Within minutes, authorities were notified. Officers spotted Patterson's vehicle and pulled him over. He surrendered immediately, telling them, "I know what this is about. I did it." The confession was swift and detailed. He admitted to everything, from his first sighting of Jamie, to the murders of her parents, to the months of captivity. He expressed no clear remorse, only a vague acknowledgement that what he had done was wrong. Charged with 2 counts of first-degree intentional homicide and 1 count of kidnapping, Patterson faced a legal process that would bring the full weight of his actions into public view. In March 2019, he pleaded guilty to all charges, avoiding a trial. His attorney stated that Patterson wanted to spare Jamie and her family further trauma. But as he left the courtroom that day, he shouted, "Bye, Jamie!" A chilling moment that demonstrated his continued fixation on his victim. Sentencing occurred on May 24th, 2019. Jamie did not attend the hearing, but her attorney read a statement on her behalf. "He thought he could own me, but he was wrong. I was smarter," she said through her lawyer. "I watched his routine and I took back my freedom. I will always have my freedom, and he will not." Family members delivered emotional testimony describing the lasting trauma inflicted on Jamie and the devastating loss of her parents. Barron County District Attorney Brian Wright argued that Patterson would never stop trying to find Jamie, if released, emphasizing that the community could only be safe if he remained locked away permanently. Judge James Babler called Patterson the embodiment of evil and described the crime as the most heinous he had encountered. He sentenced Patterson to 2 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole for the murders, plus an additional 40 years for the kidnapping. The judge made clear that Patterson would spend the rest of his life behind bars, with no chance of ever walking free. Patterson was transferred out of Wisconsin to a facility in New Mexico, where he later became involved in altercations with other inmates. He has filed appeals challenging his conviction, but none have succeeded. Jamie, meanwhile, has worked to rebuild her life with the support of relatives and the broader community. She has become an advocate for other missing and exploited children, transforming her trauma into a mission to help others. Today, Jake Patterson remains incarcerated, his name forever linked to one of Wisconsin's most disturbing abduction cases. A reminder that sometimes evil has no explanation beyond a chance encounter and a twisted desire for control. But even as Jamie's courage inspired hope, another Wisconsin story was unfolding, one that would reveal how years of deception can lead to deadly consequences. Case 5. Cindy Schulz-Juedes. The farmhouse on Dill Creek Farm seemed peaceful that August morning, 2006, but inside, Kenneth Juedes lay dead in his bed with 2 shotgun wounds and a knife-pierced note beside him, bearing a single word: bitch. Kenneth Juedes was 58 years old, a well-respected pharmacist working at Memorial Healthcare in Medford, Wisconsin. To everyone who knew him, he was energetic, warm, and dedicated, the kind of person who made others feel good just by being in the room. Divorced from his first wife, Betty, he had found happiness again with Cindy Schulz, a woman he married in 2004 after a courtship that seemed to embody genuine affection. Friends and family described them as inseparable, constantly holding hands, smiling together, radiating a contentment that made people say, nobody can be that happy. They lived on Dill Creek Farm in the town of Hull, Marathon County, where they also operated Monster Hall, Raceway, and Campground. By all outward appearances, their life together was idyllic. But on the morning of August 30th, 2006, Cindy placed a frantic call to authorities from a neighbor's house. She had discovered Ken's body in their bedroom, she said, and needed help immediately. When deputies arrived, they found a disturbing scene: Ken lying naked in bed with shotgun wounds to his chest and back, and that chilling note stabbed with a knife into the mattress nearby. The word bitch suggested anger, vengeance, or perhaps misdirection. It was, as one investigator later said, one of the most stunning clues he had ever seen. Someone was clearly sending a message. Cindy told authorities she had slept in a small camper parked behind the house that night because she had a sinus infection and didn't want to disturb Ken with her coughing. She said she woke around 8:30 in the morning, went inside, and found him dead. Investigators immediately noticed inconsistencies in her account. Why would someone choose to sleep in a cramped camper without air conditioning on a sweltering August night? Why were the surveillance cameras on the property turned off? Why were the doors unlocked? And why had the foster children, who usually stayed there, been sent away for the evening? Within days, additional red flags emerged. Shortly after Ken's death, Cindy produced a will listing her as his sole heir. His family was stunned. Ken had children from his previous marriage, and it seemed inconceivable that he would cut them out entirely after less than 3 years with Cindy. They suspected the document might be forged. Even more troubling, Cindy stood to collect nearly $1 million in life insurance policies taken out in Ken's name. To investigators and family members alike, the financial motive was glaring. Despite these suspicions, the case stalled. The murder weapon, a shotgun, was never recovered. Forensic evidence was limited. Without concrete proof linking Cindy to the crime, prosecutors could not move forward with charges. She remained a person of interest, not a suspect, and for 13 years, the case went cold while Cindy lived her life, insisting she was innocent and that police had failed to find the real perpetrator. But Detective Dennis Blazer of the Marathon County Sheriff's Office never let the case go. He took over the investigation years later, meticulously reviewing every detail, re-interviewing witnesses, and searching for new leads. In late 2019, his persistence paid off. Investigators discovered that Cindy's ex-husband had told detectives she had been given a 20-gauge shotgun years earlier, a detail that had been overlooked. Additional witnesses came forward describing Cindy's behavior in the days surrounding Ken's death as oddly detached and unemotional. Prosecutors believed they finally had enough to bring charges. In December 2019, more than 13 years after Ken's death, authorities arrested Cindy Schulz-Juedes and charged her with being a party to first-degree intentional homicide and obstructing justice. She was 66 years old at the time. The delay in charging her became a central theme of her defense. How could the state suddenly decide, after all this time, that they had a case? The trial began in October 2021. Prosecutors painted Cindy as a woman motivated by greed, who married Ken for financial security and then orchestrated his murder to claim his estate and insurance money. They argued that she had the means, motive, and knowledge to carry out the crime. She knew the property's layout, she controlled who was present that night, she had access to weapons, and she benefited enormously from his death. The timing of the surveillance cameras being disabled and the foster children being sent away suggested premeditation. Her decision to sleep in a camper on a hot summer night provided a convenient alibi. She claimed she heard nothing, saw nothing, and only discovered the body hours later. The defense countered that the state's case relied on speculation and circumstantial evidence. There was no murder weapon, no forensic proof tying Cindy to the shooting, and no witnesses placing her at the scene when Ken was attacked. They argued that 13 years of investigation had failed to produce definitive evidence because Cindy was not guilty. They suggested alternative suspects, including people who may have had grudges against Ken or business disputes related to the raceway and campground. Cindy herself took the stand, maintaining her innocence and insisting she had loved Ken deeply. But prosecutors highlighted her calm demeanor in the aftermath of his death, her quick moves to secure his estate, and her seeming lack of genuine grief. Judge Michael Moran would later describe her actions as callous and unfeeling. On October 21st, 2021, after days of deliberation, the jury found Cindy Schulz-Juedes guilty of being a party to first-degree intentional homicide and resisting or obstructing an officer. In June 2022, Judge Moran sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He emphasized the calculated nature of the crime and the profound betrayal it represented. Ken had trusted Cindy, built a life with her, and she had allegedly repaid that trust with violence. Cindy was transferred to the Etched Correctional Institution in Fond du Lac to begin serving her sentence. Her conviction brought some measure of closure to Ken's family, who had waited more than 15 years for justice. But the story took another dark turn. On July 19, 2023, guards found Cindy unresponsive in her cell. She had been attacked by her cellmate, 28-year-old Taylor Sanchez, an inmate who had stopped taking her psychiatric medications and was reportedly hearing voices. Cindy died at the age of 68 from injuries sustained in the assault. In July 2025, Sanchez was convicted of the attack and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Cindy Schulz-Juedes never admitted guilt for Ken's murder, and her death in prison ended any possibility of appeals or further revelations. For Ken's family, the tragedy compounded, first losing him to violence, then waiting over a decade for accountability, and finally seeing his convicted attacker meet a violent end herself. The case remains a haunting reminder that justice, when it finally arrives, does not always bring peace. Yet while one widow's deception took 13 years to unravel, another Wisconsin son's lies would collapse in a matter of days. Case 6. Chandler Halderson. A Snapchat location pin would become the clue that unraveled a 23-year-old's web of lies and exposed one of Wisconsin's most calculated family annihilations. Chandler Michael Halderson appeared to be thriving in the summer of 2021. He told his parents, Bart and Krista Halderson, that he was finishing his degree in renewable energy engineering at Madison Area Technical College while working remotely for an insurance company. Even more exciting, he claimed he had just landed a prestigious job at SpaceX, Elon Musk's aerospace company, and would be moving to Florida with his girlfriend later that month. His family was proud, his future seemed bright, and his parents supported him wholeheartedly as he lived at home during the pandemic. But prosecutors would later reveal that every single claim was fiction. Chandler had dropped out of college after one semester. He had no job at the insurance company. There was no SpaceX position waiting in Florida. Instead, he spent his days in his bedroom playing video games, waking early to simulate work meetings, so his father, an accountant also working from home, wouldn't become suspicious. For months, he constructed an elaborate digital mirage, fabricating emails from college administrators, creating fake transcripts, and even using burner phones to impersonate school officials during calls with his father. The deception began crumbling in late June 2021. Bart Halderson, concerned that the college was withholding his son's transcript, called the school himself and pretended to be Chandler. During that conversation, he learned the devastating truth. The administrators his son had been communicating with didn't exist, and Chandler hadn't been enrolled in months. Bart's last recorded words before his death were, "That'll be it then," spoken quietly after discovering his son's lies. He scheduled a meeting with college officials for 3 o'clock on July 1st. A meeting Chandler knew would expose everything. According to prosecutors, rather than face the consequences, Chandler chose murder. On the afternoon of July 1st, before the scheduled college meeting, he shot his father, Bart, 50 years old, in the back with an SKS rifle given to him by an online friend. Hours later, when his mother, Krista, 53, returned home. He ended her life as well. Then began a gruesome cleanup that would last days. Chandler dismembered both parents' bodies in the family home, attempting to burn remains in the fireplace. Investigators later found skull fragments in the ashes. He transported body parts in his vehicle, scattering them across southern Wisconsin, in ditches, along riverbanks, in wooded areas on farms, and in trash cans. He even asked to use a pool at his girlfriend's family farm, claiming he needed therapy for a leg injury he had faked, but was actually using the visit as cover to hide his father's torso in nearby woods. On July 7th, 6 days after the murders, Chandler reported his parents missing. He told authorities they had left for the family cabin in Langlade County to celebrate the 4th of July weekend with another couple, but never arrived. He used his mother's phone to send himself text messages pretending to be her, creating a false trail. He mentioned they might be at a casino, a claim investigators immediately doubted, as the Haldersons were known to be frugal and rarely gambled. Suspicion fell on Chandler quickly. Detective Sabrina Sims noted that his story didn't match his parents' character or habits. Then came the digital evidence that sealed his fate. Chandler's girlfriend, Catherine Melander, had been monitoring his location through Snapchat's Snap Map feature because he had cheated on her in the past. On July 3rd, while Chandler claimed he was doing chores, the app showed him in a remote forested area along the Wisconsin River. Melander thought this was unusual and screenshot the location. When she shared her phone data with investigators, they searched that exact spot and discovered Krista Halderson's dismembered legs scattered in several pieces. Bart's torso was found at the farm belonging to Melander's family in Cottage Grove, about 20 miles from the Halderson home. The farm owner told detectives she was surprised to see Chandler emerging from the property's wood line. When deputies searched the area, they found not only Bart's remains, but also saw blades, scissors, tree loppers, and a tarp covered in both victims' blood. An autopsy revealed Bart had been shot at least twice in the back. Krista's cause of death could not be determined, as only her legs were recovered. Her head has never been found. Additional evidence painted a picture of premeditation. The evening after allegedly committing the murders, Chandler created a note on his phone listing hydrogen peroxide, lemon, instructions to clean floors, and ominously, get a job. Surveillance footage from gas stations showed him hauling bags of ice. Prosecutors argued these were used to preserve his father's body. Video also captured him without the neck brace he claimed to be wearing for an injury, undermining his alibis. Chandler was arrested and charged with 2 counts of first-degree intentional homicide, providing false information about missing persons, mutilating corpses, and hiding corpses. He pleaded not guilty and went to trial in January 2022. Deputy District Attorney William Brown told jurors that Chandler had spun an amazing web of lies and murdered his parents to prevent that web from unraveling. The defense argued that while Chandler was a liar, that didn't make him a killer, and questioned how lying could escalate to such violence. But the evidence was overwhelming. On January 20th, 2022, after deliberating briefly, the jury found Chandler guilty on all 8 counts. Judge John Hyland scheduled sentencing for March. At the sentencing hearing on March 17th, 2022, prosecutor Andrea Raymond described the case as extraordinary in its brutality and lack of remorse. She noted that Chandler had grown up with privilege, loving, supportive parents who were happily married and provided everything he needed. There was no history of abuse. Yet when those same parents were memorialized, Chandler showed no grief. When a relative expressed sadness after attending the service, Chandler told them to watch Halloween, a slasher film. He never mourned his parents. Judge Hyland struggled visibly with his emotions as he considered the viciousness of the crime. He noted that Chandler had not only taken his parents' lives, but had mutilated their bodies, lied to police, and robbed those people of dignity. The judge sentenced Chandler to life in prison without the possibility of extended supervision, Wisconsin's equivalent of parole. He added that he wanted to ensure Chandler would only return to the community for one reason: to receive the burial he denied his own parents. Today, Chandler Halderson remains incarcerated, serving his life sentence. He has filed appeals challenging his conviction, but none have succeeded. Snapchat's location tracking feature, designed to help friends stay connected, became the tool that exposed his crimes and brought justice for Bart and Krista Halderson, two parents whose only mistake was believing in their son. Yet while Chandler's case shocked Wisconsin with its cold calculation, another controversy had been simmering for years, one that would divide the state and captivate the world. Case 7. Stephen Avery and Brendan Dassey. On Halloween night, 2005, photographer Teresa Halbach disappeared after visiting a salvage yard in Manitowoc County, and what followed became one of the most contentious criminal cases in American history. Stephen Avery was 43 years old when Teresa Halbach vanished, but his story with Wisconsin's criminal justice system had begun decades earlier. In 1985, Avery was wrongfully convicted of assault and attempted murder, spending 18 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. DNA evidence finally exonerated him in 2003, revealing that another man, Gregory Allen, had been the actual perpetrator. Avery's release prompted statewide discussions about wrongful convictions, leading to the Criminal Justice Reform Bill, later known as the Avery Bill, which implemented safeguards to prevent future injustices. Following his exoneration, Avery filed a $36 million civil lawsuit against Manitowoc County, its former sheriff, Thomas Kukurek, and former district attorney, Dennis Vogel, for the years stolen from him. The lawsuit was moving forward when, on October 31st, 2005, Teresa Halbach drove to Avery's Auto Salvage to photograph a minivan for Auto Trader magazine. It was her last known appointment. She was never seen alive again. On November 3rd, a missing persons report was filed. 2 days later, her vehicle was discovered on the Avery property. Over the following week, investigators found her car key in Stephen's trailer, his blood inside her vehicle, and human bones in a burn pit near his home. The bones were soon identified as Teresa's remains. Additional evidence included a bullet found in Avery's garage containing Teresa's DNA. The case against him seemed overwhelming, but Avery maintained his innocence, accusing law enforcement of framing him to undermine his civil lawsuit. His attorneys argued that evidence had been planted, pointing to suspicious circumstances. The car key was found by 2 Manitowoc deputies who were named in Avery's lawsuit, despite multiple earlier searches turning up nothing. They suggested his blood in Teresa's vehicle came from a vial of his sample stored from the 1985 case, though debates raged over whether the vial showed signs of tampering. In March 2007, after a 27-day trial, a jury found Avery guilty of first-degree murder and illegal possession of a firearm. He was acquitted on one charge: mutilation of a corpse. Judge Patrick Willis sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Avery settled his civil suit for $400,000 while in custody, a fraction of what he had sought. But the case had another devastating dimension. In March 2006, Avery's 16-year-old nephew, Brendan Dassey, was charged as an accessory after confessing to investigators that he had helped his uncle commit the crime. Brendan told detectives he and Avery had attacked Teresa, bound her, and disposed of her body. The confession was videotaped, one of the first in Wisconsin under new juvenile interrogation recording rules. However, Brendan later recanted, claiming his confession was coerced. His attorneys argued that he had been questioned without legal representation or apparent present, despite having an IQ measured between 69 and 73. They contended that investigators fed him details and made false promises that he had nothing to worry about if he cooperated. Crucially, no physical evidence linked Brendan to any crime scene. No DNA, no blood, no fingerprints anywhere. Despite these concerns, Brendan was convicted in April 2007 of being a party to first-degree intentional homicide, second-degree assault, and mutilation of a corpse. At 17 years old, he was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole in 2048, meaning he would serve at least 41 years before becoming eligible for release. Both cases might have faded from public consciousness, if not for a Netflix documentary series that premiered in December 2015. Making a Murderer, created by filmmakers Moira Demos and Laura Riccardi, examined the investigation, trial, and convictions in exhaustive detail. The 10-part series became a cultural phenomenon, turning millions of viewers into amateur investigators who debated evidence, questioned procedures, and raised concerns about whether justice had been served. The series sparked intense controversy. Supporters argued it exposed serious flaws in the prosecution's case and highlighted troubling police conduct. Critics, including prosecutor Ken Kratz and members of Teresa's family, accused the filmmakers of bias, claiming they omitted evidence supporting the convictions and portrayed events from a skewed perspective. A White House petition demanding Avery's pardon gathered over 500,000 signatures, though the response noted that the president cannot pardon state offenses. Brendan's case gained particular attention for the videotaped interrogation footage shown in the documentary. In August 2016, a federal magistrate judge ruled that Brendan's confession had been illegally obtained and overturned his conviction, ordering his release within 90 days unless the state appealed. Wisconsin authorities immediately challenged the decision. The case wound through appellate courts, with a panel initially ruling in Brendan's favor in June 2017, only to have the full Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals uphold his conviction 6 months later in a 4-3 split decision. In June 2018, the United States Supreme Court declined to hear Brendan's appeal, exhausting his federal options. Brendan's legal team, led by Northwestern University's Center on Wrongful Convictions of Youth, subsequently sought clemency from Wisconsin Governor Tony Evers. However, in December 2019, the governor determined Brendan was ineligible for pardon. The legal team emphasized that Brendan remains imprisoned based solely on a confession obtained when he was 16, intellectually limited, and without legal support. A confession they describe as coerced and contradicted by the complete absence of forensic evidence. Stephen Avery, meanwhile, continues appealing his conviction through attorney Kathleen Zellner. In August 2022, Zellner filed a massive post-conviction motion claiming new evidence points to a third-party suspect, one of Avery's nephews in the Dassey family. She alleges forensic examinations of a computer revealed searches for violent content and claims witnesses can tie this individual to Teresa's vehicle and the framing of Avery. Courts have thus far rejected these arguments, with the Wisconsin Court of Appeals upholding lower court denials as recently as January 2025. Today, both Stephen Avery and Brendan Dassey remain incarcerated. Avery, now in his 60s, serves his life sentence while pursuing appeals. Brendan, who was 16 at the time of Teresa's death, will not be eligible for parole consideration until he is 63 years old in 2048. Their cases remain among the most polarizing in American criminal justice, with passionate advocates on both sides debating guilt, innocence, and the fairness of the proceedings. The Halbach family has consistently requested privacy and expressed frustration with ongoing media attention, saying the documentaries and appeals reopen wounds while dishonoring Teresa's memory. For them, justice was served in 2007. For others, the case represents troubling questions about investigative methods, prosecutorial conduct, and the vulnerability of defendants facing the full power of the state. Whether the truth lies in the jury's verdicts or in the doubts raised by appellate attorneys, may never be fully resolved, leaving the Avery-Dassey cases as enduring symbols of justice's complexity. But while that controversy raged, another Wisconsin husband was about to face his second trial for a crime committed. Case 8. Mark Jensen. A letter written 2 weeks before her death would become the most controversial piece of evidence in Wisconsin legal history, and the reason a man would be tried twice for the same murder 25 years apart. Mark Jensen was 38 years old when he called authorities on December 3, 1998, reporting that he had found his wife, Julie, unresponsive in their bed at their Pleasant Prairie home just south of Kenosha. Julie Jensen, 40 years old, appeared to be sleeping peacefully, but she was already gone. The initial autopsy proved inconclusive, leaving medical examiners unable to determine how or why she had died. For months, the case remained a mystery, but investigators refused to let it go. They seized the family's desktop computer and discovered something chilling. At 9:42 on the morning of Julie's death, someone had searched for information about diminished consciousness from ethylene glycol poisoning. Ethylene glycol is the primary ingredient in antifreeze, a substance that, when ingested, can be lethal. Further testing revealed that Julie's blood, stomach, and urine all contained ethylene glycol. The medical examiner eventually determined her death was a homicide caused by 2 factors: antifreeze poisoning and asphyxiation. As the investigation deepened, a disturbing portrait of the Jensens' marriage emerged. On the surface, Mark and Julie had seemed like an ordinary couple raising 2 sons. But beneath that facade, their relationship had been corroding for years. In the early 1990s, Julie had an affair, a betrayal Mark never forgave. Friends and co-workers later testified that Mark became consumed by resentment, obsessed with punishing Julie psychologically. He allegedly conducted a years-long campaign of harassment, anonymously calling and emailing her, randomly placing explicit materials around their home for her to find, and keeping meticulous notes about her behavior in his planner. Notes Julie feared were designed to make her look mentally unstable. Julie's mental state had indeed deteriorated. She saw a therapist multiple times for depression, aware that Mark was having an affair of his own with a co-worker named Kelly Labonte Greeman. But Julie was also afraid. In late November 1998, days before her death, she wrote a letter addressed to local police. She included a photograph of the suspicious list she had found in Mark's planner and detailed her fears. She told a neighbor she suspected Mark was planning something terrible. "If anything happens to me, he would be my first suspect," Julie wrote. "I pray that I am wrong and nothing happens, but I am suspicious of Mark's suspicious behaviors and fear for my early demise." She placed everything in an envelope and gave it to the neighbor with instructions. "If something happens to me, give this to police." She also left voicemails for authorities expressing the same concerns, emphasizing that she would never commit suicide. When prosecutors finally charged Mark Jensen with murder in 2002, 4 years after Julie's death, that letter became central to their case. They argued Mark had poisoned Julie with antifreeze over several days, then panicked when the doses didn't kill her quickly enough. According to testimony from a jailhouse informant, Mark confessed that when Julie's breathing improved slightly, he rolled her over and suffocated her with a pillow. The murder freed him to openly pursue his relationship with Kelly, whom he later married and who assumed custody of his 2 sons after his imprisonment. Mark's defense attorneys countered that Julie was a deeply troubled woman who died by suicide while deliberately framing her husband. They pointed to her depression, her therapy sessions, and her awareness of Mark's affair as evidence of her mental state. The trial, which began in 2008 after being moved to Walworth County due to pretrial publicity, lasted 27 days. On the critical question of whether Julie's letter and voicemails could be admitted as evidence, the court ruled they were admissible under the doctrine of forfeiture by wrongdoing, the legal principle that a defendant cannot benefit from silencing a witness through murder. The jury found Mark Jensen guilty of first-degree intentional homicide. Judge Bruce Schroeder sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. It seemed the case was closed, but Mark's attorneys filed appeals challenging the admission of Julie's letter, arguing it violated his Sixth Amendment right to confront witnesses against him. Since Julie was dead, Mark could never cross-examine her, making the letter testimonial hearsay that should have been excluded. The issue worked its way through Wisconsin courts, reaching the state Supreme Court and involving related rulings from the United States Supreme Court on testimonial evidence. In 2013, a federal judge agreed. U.S. District Judge William Griesbach vacated Mark's conviction, ruling that admitting Julie's from the grave statements violated constitutional protections and was not harmless error. The state immediately prepared to retry the case. After multiple procedural battles, including one judge reinstating the conviction without trial, only to be overturned again by the Wisconsin Supreme Court, a new trial was finally ordered for January 2023. This time, prosecutors faced a monumental challenge, proving Mark's guilt without the letter or voicemails that jurors in the first trial said were key to conviction. Lead prosecutor Robert Jambois, who had handled the original case, returned to build a circumstantial case based on other evidence. He presented the computer search history, the ethylene glycol in Julie's system, testimony from Mark's co-workers about conversations discussing poisoning, and statements from the jailhouse informant. He also called Kelly Labonte, Mark's second wife, who had since divorced him, to testify about the affair and Mark's behavior. Defense attorney Mackenzie Renner argued that Julie was an unreliable narrator who told conflicting stories about her marriage, and that Mark was simply a bad husband, not a murderer. The jury deliberated for less than one full day after 15 days of testimony. On February 1st, 2023, they returned a unanimous verdict, guilty of first-degree intentional homicide. It was the second time in 2 decades that Mark Jensen had been convicted of poisoning his wife. Sentencing occurred on April 14th, 2023, before Judge Anthony Milisauskas, the third Kenosha judge to preside over the case. Mark's attorneys requested parole eligibility after 20 years, noting he had already served 15 years since his original conviction. But Judge Milisauskas rejected the request, citing overwhelming evidence of guilt and the prolonged, calculated cruelty of the crime. He described how Mark had psychologically tortured Julie for years before researching her murder, executing it over multiple days, and watching her suffer. This was planned out for a long time. It was intentional. It was researched for the purpose of evil, the judge said. He's not getting any parole eligibility. Mark Jensen received life in prison without parole for the second time. He returned to Dodge Correctional Institution in Waupun, where he had already spent a decade and a half. He has stated his intention to appeal the second conviction, maintaining his innocence and claiming Julie orchestrated an elaborate frame-up before taking her own life. For Julie's family, the second conviction brought renewed closure after years of legal uncertainty. Her 3 brothers delivered emotional impact statements describing the lasting pain of losing their sister and the frustration of watching the case drag on for a quarter century. Prosecutor Jambois noted that Mark never showed genuine remorse, never apologized, and never acknowledged responsibility. Today, Mark Jensen remains behind bars, his name forever associated with one of Wisconsin's most complex legal sagas, a case where justice required 2 decades, 2 trials, and 2 convictions to finally hold. But while Mark Jensen's crimes unfolded over years of calculated planning, another Wisconsin predator operated in shadows for more than 2 decades before DNA technology finally caught up with him. Case 9. Walter Ellis. For 21 years, women on Milwaukee's North Side disappeared and turned up dead, strangled and abandoned in alleys, vacant buildings, and along roadsides. And for 21 years, a killer walked free among them. Walter Earl Ellis was born on June 24, 1960, in Holmes County, Mississippi, the 4th of 6 children in a family that would relocate to Milwaukee's North Side during his childhood. From an early age, Ellis displayed troubling behavior, impulsive, aggressive, and violent toward peers. He assaulted classmates and neighborhood children repeatedly, establishing a pattern that would only intensify as he aged. By his teenage years, he had embarked on a criminal path that would span decades, accumulating arrests for assault, theft, drug distribution, and domestic violence. Ellis's criminal record was extensive even before his first known murder. In 1986, he attacked a police officer during an arrest for disturbing the peace, earning 7 months in county jail. Released in May 1987, he was rearrested almost immediately for theft. In 1988, he was convicted of attempted carjacking after harming another arresting officer. By 1990, he had joined a Milwaukee drug trafficking organization and was sentenced to federal prison for distribution. Throughout the 90s, he repeatedly violated parole conditions, assaulting multiple girlfriends, injuring one with a screwdriver, yet avoided serious consequences by serving as a police informant. That protected status ended in 1998, after additional offenses led authorities to sever contact with him. He served 3 years at Oshkosh Correctional Institution and was released in July 2001. But Ellis's most horrific crimes had begun years earlier, hidden within the chaos of his documented offenses. On October 10, 1986, the body of 31-year-old Deborah Harris was found in the Milwaukee River, strangled. The very next day, October 11th, 19-year-old Tanya Miller was discovered, also strangled. Both women were African American, both had been assaulted, and both were left in locations suggesting the killer knew the North Side intimately. Investigators suspected the deaths were connected, but lacked the forensic tools to prove it. Over the following 2 decades, 5 more women would die in eerily similar fashion. 25-year-old Irene Smith in November 1992. 28-year-old Florence McCormick in April 1995. 37-year-old Sheila Ferrier in June 1995. 41-year-old Joyce Mims in June 1997. And 28-year-old Withron Stokes in April 2007. All were Black women between the ages of 19 and 41. All were strangled, some by hand, others with rope or fabric. Most were involved in street-level activities that made them vulnerable targets. Their bodies were dumped in abandoned buildings, alleys, and isolated areas across Milwaukee's North Side. For years, detectives investigated each case separately, unaware they were hunting a single perpetrator. Milwaukee Police Homicide Detective Stephen Spingola worked the Ferrier and McCormick cases, even authoring a detailed criminal profile of the likely killer that colleagues later described as eerily accurate. But Spingola retired before the breakthrough came, and the cases went cold. That breakthrough arrived in May 2009, when Milwaukee's Cold Case Homicide Unit, led by detectives Gilbert Hernandez and Kathy Hine, re-examined DNA evidence using advanced testing techniques. they discovered a genetic profile linking all 7 murders. The same person had left biological evidence on every victim. Now they needed to match that profile to a suspect. The match came from an unexpected source, a 2002 assault conviction that should have placed Ellis's DNA in Wisconsin's database years earlier. But due to flaws in the state's collection and verification procedures, his sample had never been properly entered. When investigators finally ran the comparison in 2009, the results were definitive. Walter Ellis's DNA matched evidence from 7 murder scenes spanning 21 years. On September 7, 2009, police located Ellis at a motel in Franklin, Wisconsin, where he was staying with a 54-year-old girlfriend who was unaware of his crimes. He struggled briefly with officers before being taken into custody. Inside the room, police found a small quantity of crack cocaine and drug paraphernalia. Ellis was initially charged with 2 counts of first-degree intentional homicide for the Mims and Stokes murders. Days later, prosecutors added 5 more charges, bringing the total to 7. The evidence against him was irrefutable. Semen samples recovered from the victims' bodies matched Ellis's genetic profile. The strangulation methods were consistent across cases. The geographic clustering on Milwaukee's north side corresponded to areas where Ellis lived and operated. Faced with overwhelming forensic proof, Ellis's attorney recommended accepting a plea agreement. In February 2011, Ellis pleaded no contest to all 7 counts of first-degree intentional homicide, avoiding trial. On February 24, 2011, Judge Dennis Simple sentenced him to 7 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. At the sentencing hearing, victims' relatives delivered emotional statements. Some called Ellis the devil. Others expressed wishes that Wisconsin had the death penalty. Several remembered the victims not as statistics, but as mothers, daughters, and sisters whose troubled lives didn't diminish their value or justify their suffering. Ellis sat impassive throughout, showing no reaction as families spoke of decades of grief and unanswered questions. Judge Simple noted that the only factor in Ellis's favor, sparing families a trial, was like weighing a feather against thousands of pounds of bad things. The judge emphasized that Ellis would never leave prison alive. After conviction, Ellis was transferred to serve his sentence at South Dakota State Penitentiary in Sioux Falls under an interstate agreement. His health deteriorated rapidly. Diagnosed with diabetes and other conditions, he was moved to a prison hospital. On December 1, 2013, less than 3 years into his sentence, Walter Ellis died at age 53. His death brought a measure of closure, but also highlighted systemic failures. The case exposed how gaps in Wisconsin's DNA database protocols had allowed Ellis to evade detection for over 2 decades, despite being in custody multiple times. Authorities later determined that at least 2 other men had been wrongfully convicted for murders Ellis actually committed. One was Shante Ott, convicted in 1996, based on jailhouse informant testimony for the death of Jessica Payne. A killing DNA would eventually link to Ellis. The Ellis case prompted significant reforms in how Wisconsin collects, verifies, and maintains DNA samples from convicted offenders. It also sparked conversations about the vulnerability of marginalized communities and how victims dismissed as high risk often receive less investigative attention until patterns become undeniable. Today, Walter Ellis's name remains synonymous with one of Milwaukee's longest-running serial murder cases, a reminder that justice delayed can mean justice denied for far too many victims. Yet even as Ellis's decades-long spree finally ended, another Milwaukee tragedy was about to unfold, one that would grip the nation and raise urgent questions about violence, dating, and safety in the digital age. Case 10. Maxwell Anderson, a first date that began with drinks and laughter, ended with a young woman's dismembered remains scattered across Milwaukee, and a city demanding answers about how something so horrific could happen. Maxwell Anderson was 33 years old in April 2024, working as a bartender in Milwaukee and living in an apartment on the city's south side. Sade Robinson was 19, a student at Milwaukee Area Technical College who worked 2 jobs while pursuing her education. She had grown up facing challenges, but was building a life on her own terms, determined to achieve independence. The two met at a bar in late March and made plans to go out on April 1st. Surveillance footage captured them arriving together that evening at the Twisted Fisherman, a seafood restaurant on West Canal Street. They spent hours drinking at 2 different bars before returning to Anderson's apartment. What happened next would only be revealed through digital evidence, witness testimony, and the grim discoveries that followed. Photographs found on Anderson's phone showed him groping Sade as she lay face down on his couch. Prosecutors argued she was incapacitated and unable to resist. Early on the morning of April 2nd, surveillance cameras recorded her vehicle leaving his apartment and driving to Warnemont Park in Cudahy, a location along the Lake Michigan shoreline. Prosecutors maintained this was where Anderson dismembered her body. Later that morning, Sade's car was found torched behind an abandoned building. Video footage showed Anderson leaving the scene and boarding a bus home, his clothes appearing clean despite what prosecutors alleged he had just done. That afternoon, a passerby discovered a human leg severed at the hip down a bluff in Warnemont Park. 4 days later, a foot was found near 31st and Galena Streets in Milwaukee's Walnut Hill neighborhood. On April 18th, a torso and arm washed up on a remote stretch of beach in South Milwaukee. Weeks later, another arm believed to be Sade's was discovered at Waukegan Municipal Beach in Illinois, 53 miles from Milwaukee. Sade's head has never been found. On April 2nd, when friends couldn't reach Sade, they reported her missing. On April 4th, the Milwaukee County Sheriff's Office pulled Anderson over during a traffic stop and arrested him. The investigation moved swiftly as evidence mounted. The surveillance footage, the location data, the photographs on his phone, and the physical evidence linking him to the crime scenes. In the trunk of his vehicle, investigators found saw blades, scissors, tree loppers, and a tarp covered with Sade's blood. Anderson was charged with first-degree intentional homicide, mutilating a corpse, arson, and hiding a corpse. He pleaded not guilty and maintained his innocence throughout the legal process, claiming that some unknown assailant must have abducted Sade after she left his apartment. His trial began in late May 2025. Prosecutors presented a methodical case showing Anderson's opportunity, the physical evidence tying him to the dismemberment, and the calculated steps he took to destroy evidence by burning her car. Assistant District Attorney Ian Vance Curzon emphasized the brutality of the crime during closing arguments. "What kind of person cuts off someone's head?" he asked the jury. A killer who's trying to get away with killing." Anderson's attorney, Tony Cotton, argued that prosecutors failed to prove Anderson intended to kill Sade, a necessary element for first-degree intentional homicide. He pointed out that nobody heard a struggle in Anderson's apartment, that Anderson made no attempt to conceal his identity when boarding the bus, and that his clothing appeared clean when captured on camera shortly after the alleged dismemberment. Cotton suggested the evidence was circumstantial and insufficient. The jury disagreed. On June 6, 2025, after deliberating for just 45 minutes across 2 days following 15 days of testimony, they returned guilty verdicts on all counts. The verdict brought relief, but no real peace to Sade's family. Her mother, Sheena Scarborough, told reporters afterward, "There's no such thing as justice. We don't have her. Sentencing occurred on August 1st, 2025. Judge Laura Crivello repeatedly questioned how anyone could commit such a heinous crime, calling it one of the worst homicides I've seen in this court. Family members delivered devastating impact statements. Said's 16-year-old sister, Adriana Reams, described having to physically pick their mother up off the ground while managing her own grief. She spoke of the horror no teenager should endure, communicating with law enforcement, caring for family members too broken to function, all while processing the loss of her protector and role model. What he did was much more than just murder or dismember her, Adriana said. He erased her independence, her ability to fight for herself. He tried to erase her existence and her value. Said's father, Carlos Robinson, suggested to the judge that Anderson should suffer the same fate he inflicted on Said. Everything that he did should be done to him, he said. No man should be able to live after what he did. Said's mother addressed Anderson directly, her voice filled with anguish and rage. You plotted and planned to kill, dismember, then you disrespectfully spread my daughter across Milwaukee like a piece of trash, Scarborough said. Judge, I'm asking that this demon be respectfully returned back to hell as soon as possible. He needs to be placed in population with the rest of the demons that harm and hurt individuals. Anderson's attorney requested parole eligibility after 25 years, citing his military service in the Navy and arguing he deserved a chance at rehabilitation. But Judge Crivello was unmoved. She noted Anderson's complete lack of accountability throughout the trial, his refusal to provide details about what happened to Said's remains, and his continued insistence on innocence, despite overwhelming evidence. It's beyond imaginable to not know whether your child is dead or alive, and then learn they're dismembered and disgraced. The Wu, judge said, her voice trailing off as she shook her head. She called his crimes unconscionable and likened the case to something from a horror novel. She concluded that Anderson was irredeemable. Judge Crivello sentenced Anderson to life in prison without the possibility of parole on the homicide count, plus 7.5 years for mutilating a corpse and 18 months for arson, all to be served consecutively. She dismissed the charge of hiding a corpse after Anderson's attorneys argued Wisconsin law prevents conviction on both mutilation and hiding charges simultaneously. Anderson maintains he will appeal, insisting from his brief remarks at sentencing that true justice will be delivered, and claiming he was wrongfully convicted. But for Said Robinson's family, the legal process is over. Milwaukee Area Technical College awarded Said a posthumous associate's degree in May 2024, recognizing the education she never got to complete. Today, Maxwell Anderson sits in a Wisconsin prison, his name representing one of the state's most brutal and senseless crimes in recent memory. Said Robinson's family continues seeking her missing remains, knowing that until she can be laid to rest completely, their nightmare will never truly end. Her story became a rallying cry for advocates addressing violence against young Black women, whose cases often receive less media attention and investigative resources. Said Robinson will be remembered not for how she died, but for her determination, her resilience, and the future that was stolen from her on what should have been just a first date.